I'm just outside of Hebron, Ohio at the George's Chapel, or Luray Cemetery. This old graveyard had its last burial in 1884, and it's been mostly forgotten ever since. But even when it was active, many locals would avoid it at all costs. You see, it had a reputation for being haunted. The ghost is thought to be one of the people entombed in there, a land surveyor by the name of James Holmes. Now, at the time of his death in 1848, Holmes was considered one of the wealthiest people in Licking County. He was also rather avant-garde by 1840s rural Ohio standards. Against Christian teachings, he freely touted the idea that the soul did not survive the death of the body. Most cavalier. Despite his disregard for the afterlife, Holmes didn't care much for the notion of decomposition. On his deathbed, he said, "No worm shall bore its way through my once living flesh. No slimy slug or snail or bug shall make a meal of me." And to combat the corruption of his earthly remains, he instructed that upon his death, his body would be placed within a copper coffin that would then be filled to the brim with alcohol and sealed within those four walls. So unusual was this request that one mourner noted the graveside service seemed more like a scene from a saloon than a funeral. His wife refused to allow her body to be laid to rest beside her alcohol-infused husband and opted for a more traditional in-ground burial there. James didn't have to worry about drinking alone for long, though. 15 years after his passing, one of his daughters happened to drop dead while visiting from Indiana. Her siblings decided to have her embalmed using the more modern chemical infusion technique, and she was then placed in the crypt next to Father. So how well do these preservation techniques work? Very well, it turns out. In 1903, some curious ghouls heard about the unusual inhumations here, and they decided they'd like to see for themselves. So they broke inside to the grave, and much to their delight, discovered that the coffins had been very conveniently constructed with glass viewing windows. Word got out, and people came from all over to gaze upon the perfectly embalmed old man swimming around in what the local church folk called the Devil's Bath. The daughter was also fairly well preserved, with the exception of her mouth. Her lower jaw had gone slack, causing her upper dentures to fall down and give her corpse a ghastly smile. When the family found out about the vandalism, they were livid. They went to work having the tomb resealed and encased in the concrete you see today. So sorry, would-be grave robbers, there'll be no hauling that copper coffin off to the salvage yard or using the old man's stew to make hand sanitizer. That would probably be cheaper and faster than ordering it from Amazon. Now, despite the family going to such great lengths to ensure that nobody could get into that crypt, it seems the old man has no difficulty getting out. For over half a century following his death, passers-by would report seeing a tall, slender figure wandering through the graveyard in the gloom of night. It was a surveyor, dressed in out-of-date clothing, with his rod and transit slung over his shoulder. But even more terrible than the vision of the specter itself was the unearthly illumination shining from behind its closed eyelids as its form glided noiselessly across the grounds. Those unfortunate enough to witness this spectacle said that as the ghost passed, an ice-cold wind would fan their cheek that chilled them to the core. Others who happened to find themselves in the vicinity of the graveyard at night claimed to hear the sound of wet footsteps sloshing directly behind them and the gurgling of alcohol as the pickled phantom kept pace. This would cause even the most courageous and resolute of characters to flee this place in terror. Now, as foot traffic became less and less common in this area, so did sightings of the ghost. And at the time of this video recording, these old tales have been all but forgotten, which will go a long way in explaining the inquisitive stares I'm getting from the people that live near here. So there you have the story of the ghosts of the Luray Cemetery, James Holmes, the original booze and boozer. Way to go, Holmes.